where you see the passing of time.
The crowds in St. Peter's Square are praying like mad for the Pope's life.
Where moments refuse to die.
This is a momentous hour in world history. This is the invasion of Hitler's Europe.
And where victory lives on.
Plenty of girls are being kissed by plenty of boys they don't know, and they do not care.
You can love it, hate it, embrace it, or turn away.
Lenin was shot to death late last night outside his apartment building.
But it is a past we all share.
Come on out here and give me a salute. Big Davy salute.
This is where yesterday has a home, where we wonder what it was like back then.
Go forward, knights, in safety.
And not too long ago.
His spirit must live on.
It's where history has its place and where the past comes alive. The History Channel.
These stones, this land, this fertile soil upon which no Roman centurion ever trod. This isolated and most westerly outpost of Europe. This land of warring clans and ancient culture for centuries under English rule. This nation of divided loyalties, where some still struggle for independence, while their neighbours stay loyal to the British Crown. This is a land of resilient people, a land of poets and artists, politicians and entrepreneurs, farmers and industrialists. This independent republic has the fastest growing economy in Europe. This land is Ireland. The earliest settlers in Ireland were hunters and fishermen. These primitive people settled along the coast and river valleys in the north, eking out a living as best they could in what was often a hostile environment. A new wave of settlers brought new skills to the country. New Stone Age people knew about agriculture. Their abilities enabled them to make permanent settlements in Ireland and mark the beginning of civilized life. These farming people placed great importance on their funeral rites, as is evident from these dolmens. 2 or 3 standing stones supporting a huge capstone mark an ancient burial place. By far the most impressive sights are those found in the Boyne Valley in County Meath, an Irish Valley of the Kings. The construction of these tombs show astonishing levels of technical skill. For example, the roofing stones at Newgrange are concave to carry off rainwater. Newgrange, at over 4,000 years old, is the crowning glory of the Boyne Valley tombs. The central chamber, deep inside the mound itself, is constructed so as to be illuminated by the rising sun on the winter solstice and on that day alone. The people who built this amazing structure had to be skilled in solar observation in order to calculate the length of the sun's rays at the solstice. By around 2000 BC, the Bronze Age had arrived in Ireland. Many examples of bronze and gold work are as fine as any found in Northern Europe of the same age. The Bronze Age was followed by the Iron Age and by new invaders from Europe. With their iron weapons, they swept all before them. They were the Celts. Different Celtic tribal groups settled in various parts of the country, the last being the Gael, who gradually conquered the whole island. By 400 AD, they had achieved total domination with their language and Gaelic culture. Artificial islands, or crannogs, were constructed in lakes from layers of stones, tree trunks, and earth. Approached by dugout canoe or simple bridge, these lake villages provided shelter and safety for the occupants. While much of Europe was under the influence of the Roman Empire, Ireland, not being part of that empire, was left to develop in its own way. Under a network of 150 different kingdoms, there were no fewer than 27 different classes of freemen, at the top of the pile being the regional kings, lawyers, druids, and poets. Celtic Ireland was split into two major tribal coalitions, the Connachtha in the north and the Onacht in the south. Of the northern tribes, the most influential were the Ine, ancestors of the modern O'Neills. Although they all shared common language and currency based on the value of cattle, there were constant battles over land, slaves, and the cattle themselves. This was a completely rural society. Gaelic Ireland built no towns. Irish warriors made forays and raiding parties to the British mainland, making settlements on the Welsh coast. And it was these contacts with a Britain by now under the influence of a Christian Roman Empire that paved the way for Christianity to enter Ireland. And the Apostle of Ireland was St. Patrick. The son of a civil servant in Roman Britain, Patrick was abducted by Irish raiders as a young man and sold into slavery near Sleamish Mountain in County Antrim. After 6 years he escaped and returned to Britain, becoming a priest, then a bishop. I saw in a dream a man called Victor, who seemed to be from Ireland and had many letters. He gave me one, and I read the opening words, "The Voice of the Irish." And as I read that beginning, I seemed at that moment to hear the voice of those people. They cried as with one voice, "We beg you, holy youth, come and walk once more among us." Upon hearing those words in a vision, St. Patrick returned to Ireland in 432 AD to spread the faith, particularly in those northeastern parts of the island not yet dominated by the kingdom of the Ine. Patrick may not have been the only Christian missionary in Ireland, but he was certainly the most famous. Since there were no towns in Ireland, monasteries assumed huge significance as seats of learning. But Christianity in Ireland had to adapt to local traditions, such as allowing divorce, which was available under the Celtic Brehon law. With the fall of the Roman Empire, Christianity also declined in most of Europe, giving Irish missionaries their greatest task, to re-evangelize the continent, which they did with staggering success, with Irish missionary centers being established from Iona to Kiev. The tranquil life of religious contemplation in Irish monasteries produced a golden age from about 500 to 795 AD. This peaceful world was then shattered by Viking raids seeking to plunder the rich monasteries. With their mastery of the longboat, the Vikings could move with terrifying speed on sea or river. The Vikings were more advanced in military skills than the Gaelic kings and plundered ruthlessly wherever they could. Setting up bases on the east coast, which were to become the first Irish towns, they attacked defenseless monasteries, trading their spoils and goods with other Viking settlements in England, particularly Jorvik, or York as it is known today. In an attempt to survive the Viking raids, the monasteries developed their distinctive round towers. The monks would retreat into the tower through a high doorway, raising the ladder behind them. Eventually the Gaels learned to combat and indeed acquire the fighting skills of the Vikings, though these skills only served to enhance the breakup of a relatively stable system, with more tribal leaders fighting amongst themselves or making loose alliances with Vikings. However, in 976, one man, Brian Boru, became king of an area of East County Clare known as Dal Chesha. He won the kingdom of Munster in battle, and in 1005 forced the submission of all the Ainail clans to become the first real king of all Ireland. But this unity was not to last, for although he beat a revolt in 1014 consisting of an alliance between Leinstermen and Norse, he died in the Battle of Clontarf, and with him died any possibility of a united Gaelic kingdom. So the old pattern of clan fighting resumed, with the O'Briens, as Brian Boru's successors now called themselves, fighting with the Ainail. Though by the middle of the 12th century, both groups had been eclipsed by the O'Connors of Connacht. But across the water, England was now a Norman country. Over 100 years had gone by since the Norman invasion and the Battle of Hastings, and by 1169, the Anglo-Normans, part of a Norman cultural outreach which already embraced much of Europe, did what the Romans never thought worth the bother. They invaded Ireland. Diarmid MacMurrough was the deposed King of Leinster who wanted his kingdom back. So he turned to Henry II, the Norman King of England, for help. Henry allowed him to drum up the support of restless Norman warlords on the English-Welsh border. Diarmid's principal recruit was Richard de Clare, better known as Strongbow, who led the Norman invasion of Ireland. They landed in County Wexford on the beach of Baginbun. The Normans were vastly more advanced than the Irish in military skills, and soon they had captured much of the east, including Dublin and the other towns. Later, Henry II came over to claim all this for himself. Thus began the long involvement of the English crown in Ireland. The Normans revolutionized Ireland. They introduced feudalism, and in barely 3 generations, they owned almost 75% of all the land. They built enormous military structures like these in Limerick and Carrickfergus. They were irresistible. After the conquering soldiers came the lawyers to draw up the deeds of ownership, and the Norman builders to build the fortified houses and castles to help them hold on to what they had gained. Large areas known as Norman liberties were administered independently, local lords handling peacekeeping, justice, and revenue collection. These semi-independent Norman lords were largely free of distant royal control. The Gaels soon learned the Norman ways as they had once learned the Norse ones, and with the aid of Scottish mercenaries, they had taken back much of Ireland by the middle of the 14th century. Only the great Anglo-Norman powers in the south and east remained intact. 2 branches of the Fitzgeralds in Kildare, Desmond in West Munster, and the Butlers of Ormond in Kilkenny and East Munster. Though many of them were fairly Gaelicised anyway, through intermarriage and the adoption of language. This cultural infiltration of the Norman colony led to the Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366, forbidding the adoption of Gaelic ways and language. The statutes were generally ignored, and the Gaelic resurgence continued, prompting King Richard II to come to Ireland not once, but twice, to fight the Gaelic chieftain Art MacMurrough Kavanagh. He failed on both occasions. This failure of English royal power allowed the Hiberno-Norman lords, especially the Butlers and the two branches of the Fitzgeralds, to increase their power base and influence. Over in England, battles continued between the houses of York and Lancaster for the English throne. By 1461, Edward of York triumphed and became Edward IV of England. Both branches of the Fitzgeralds were Yorkists, as opposed to the Butlers' Lancastrian sympathies. They were naturally favoured by the king, who appointed the Earl of Desmond as Chief Governor of Ireland. Unfortunately for the Earl, he proved to be a little too Gaelicised for the king's liking and was summarily beheaded. His Fitzgerald cousins, the House of Kildare, then acquired the title in 1470, and by 1478 had consolidated power in their own hands. Gearoid Moore Fitzgerald, 8th Earl of Kildare, ruled like a king. The Fitzgeralds paid for their own armies, raised their own taxes, controlled patronage and jobs, but never made the mistake of actually proclaiming themselves kings of Ireland. This was a situation which the English king found quite agreeable, ruling Ireland without having to pay for it. For all their awesome power, the earls still had to answer to the English king. If only they knew the upheaval that would be caused by the son of Henry VII. The early Tudor kings of England, Henry VII and Henry VIII, were constantly anxious about securing the succession. They remembered the chaos caused by the Wars of the Roses. So when Henry VIII's wife, Catherine of Aragon, failed to provide him with a son and heir, he looked to divorce her. In order to divorce his wife, Henry decided to renounce the spiritual authority of the Pope, declaring himself head of the Church of England. The English in the area around Dublin, known as the Pale, were enthusiastic royalists and plotted against the Earl of Kildare. He was summoned to London, leaving his son in charge with instructions to show force if he didn't return. The Kildare Fitzgeralds still thought they could wield huge influence over the English crown, but were terribly wrong. The Earl died in the Tower of London. His son was executed, and the power of the Fitzgeralds was crushed ruthlessly. The dissolution of the monasteries was Henry's next tactic, remitting all their revenues to the state, obliging the Gaelic chieftains to surrender their land, and then having it re-granted to them, but under English legal title, and making himself formally King of Ireland in 1541. Previously, the King of England had only styled himself Lord of Ireland. This was all fertile ground from which his daughter Queen Elizabeth launched the next revolution. She adopted the Reformation ideas that had been growing in England during her father's time. England became a Protestant state. In his rage at a powerful European country like England deserting the flock, Pope Pius V excommunicated the Queen and released her Catholic subjects from any obedience to her. This didn't stop a steady stream of English Protestant migration, particularly to East Ulster, encouraged by the Queen during her 45-year reign. In the old earldom of Desmond, there was a rebellion in the name of traditional liberties and the old religion, but it was crushed by the English. The power of the Desmond Fitzgeralds ebbed away like that of their Kildare cousins. Munster was opened up for English settlers. At the other end of the island, in Ulster, Hugh O'Neill was the leader of the historic O'Neill clan. He was an intelligent and cunning man who, when under pressure from the new English settlers and their military leaders, managed to hold his own in a defensive war among territory and landscape little known to the enemy.
Whatever man is not on our side and will not spend himself in the interests of justice, we take him to be a man against us. Therefore, wherever you do good for yourself, do us ill to the best of your ability, and we will do you ill to the best of ours, with God's will.
What O'Neill needed was an attacking force. This was not something he had any knowledge of, so he decided to recruit an army from England's most hated enemy, Spain. Ireland was thus drawn into the European wars of religion. In 1601, the Catholic King Philip III of Spain sent an army to help O'Neill. Unfortunately, they landed at Kinsale in County Cork, not the most convenient location for O'Neill, who had to march south to meet them. Under the command of Lord Mountjoy, the English troops totally defeated O'Neill's Gaelic-Spanish alliance, signalling the end of Gaelic Ireland. When Queen Elizabeth died childless in 1603, the throne passed to her cousin James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. Within 4 years of the new king's reign, Hugh O'Neill and his fellow survivors of the Battle of Kinsale had had enough of the constant harassment of the new English administration in Dublin. And in 1607, they took a ship bound for the continent, never to return. This flight of the Earls left Ulster prey to the Dublin regime, who confiscated all O'Neill and O'Donnell lands for the Crown in their determination to replace Gaelic barbarism with English civility. Over 2 million acres of fertile land in West Ulster was liberated and planted with loyal English and Scots Protestants. Other areas of Ireland were also planted in this way, but none so thoroughly as Ulster. This thoroughgoing plantation of Ulster, with its introduction of new settlers, alien in language, religion and nationality, was the root cause of the modern divisions in Northern Ireland. The English and Scots planters were modernizers, bringing new technologies, advanced agricultural techniques and modern methods. They built towns and prospered, owing their loyalties to the state with the monarchy and its laws at the centre, unlike the Gaelic communities with their decentralised local loyalties. A general sense of superiority was bound to prevail, though there was perpetual fear of a Catholic resurgence. Charles I, a moderate Anglican, succeeded his father James as king in 1625. He was reasonably indulgent towards the Irish Catholic landowners, who still owned 80% of all land outside Ulster. This indulgence was not so much born out of natural tolerance on his part, more the need for a constant source of cash to pay for the defence of Ireland against a possible invasion by Spain. In 1628, the Old English Catholics of Norman descent extracted a promise from King Charles in exchange for the sum of £120,000 to confirm their land rights and relieve them of the pressure of the new English colonists. The king gratefully took the cash, but only kept his side of the bargain for a few years until the threat of a Spanish invasion had passed. Charles was under great pressure from the Calvinists in England, to support the land claims of their English friends in Ireland. In 1633, the king sent a new governor to Ireland, Thomas Wentworth. He, like the king, was an Anglican and disliked the new English Calvinists and the old English Catholics alike for their refusal to conform to the state religion. Consequently, he managed to antagonize people on every side, especially as he tried to squeeze as much tax revenue as he could out of them. The reason being the need to support Charles' desire to rule absolute without Parliament as a divine right along the lines of the French and Spanish kings, answerable only to God. In the end, Wentworth's rule was a failure, and he was recalled to England in 1640. The king's desire for uniform Anglicanism throughout the realm drove the Scots Calvinists to rebellion. It was the need to finance a war against them that finally caused him to recall Parliament in 1640. But his relations with the parliamentary leaders, most of them Calvinists themselves, was so poor that by 1642 the two sides had taken up arms against each other in the English Civil War. In the meantime, events in Ulster had taken an ugly turn. The embittered and dispossessed natives turned on the Protestant settler population. Great numbers of Protestants were butchered and churches desecrated, and the date of 1641 is one which is burned in the memory of Ulster Protestants even today. None of the various groups and factions in Ireland was strong enough to overcome the others. Whoever won the Civil War in England would be the only force able to crack the whip in Ireland. In 1649, the English parliamentarians' victory was followed by the execution of King Charles. They then set their sights on seeking revenge for the 1641 massacres in Ireland. Their leader was Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell had arguably the best fighting force in Europe at his disposal. This new model army was battle-hardened, disciplined and ruthless. Having defeated the Royalist army in England, they fervently believed that God was on their side. So, fortified with righteousness, these Puritan warriors set forth to Ireland on a mission to avenge the victims of the Ulster massacres. Within 2 months, Cromwell had the eastern half of the island under control. He butchered the whole garrison at Drogheda, an act which shocked the whole of Europe. He went on to do the same at Wexford.
This is a righteous judgment of God upon those barbarous wretches who imbrued their hands in so much innocent blood.
This was Cromwell's justification after slaughtering an estimated 2,000 soldiers and clergy at Drogheda. The army pressed on to the west, meeting little resistance from towns who had heard of the fate of Drogheda. Building bridges to aid their advance, such as this one at Glengariff, said to have been built by order of Cromwell at an hour's notice. By 1652, even the remotest parts of Western Ireland had been conquered. Every Catholic landowner outside Connacht was now being dispossessed on the grounds that all Catholics were complicit in the 1641 massacres. 11 million acres of land were confiscated and settled by soldiers and adventurers. These adventurers had invested money into the parliamentary army and were now due their dividend. East of the River Shannon, not a single Catholic landowner remained in possession. Some of the dispossessed fled to the continent, while others were sent to the West Indies as indentured servants, a polite name for slaves. Back in England, however, people grew tired of the fanatically strict Puritan rule, and 2 years after Cromwell's death, Charles II was invited to resume his father's throne. Not wishing to lose his head, as his father had before him, the king tried his best not to offend any powerful interest groups. This meant allowing the Scots Presbyterians their freedom to worship. But in Ireland, Charles did not risk offending the new Cromwellian settlers. Only an influential minority of the old landowners got their lands restored in the 1660s. For the most part, Charles himself, only a moderate Anglican, left the Irish in peace, whilst building impressive fortresses along the Irish coast to protect the land from possible invasion. Turmoil, however, came in the shape of Charles' brother, the Duke of York. The Duke was intelligent, but lacked judgment. He rather liked the idea of absolute rule, and looked on Louis XIV of France as the perfect example. He was also a Catholic, and when King Charles died without an heir, the Duke succeeded to the English throne as James II. The restoration of the Catholic faith had now begun. This was much welcomed in Ireland, but was obviously viewed with great suspicion in Protestant England and Scotland. The situation seriously worried the English, and when King James' Queen produced a male heir, which would have secured the Catholic succession, it was the final straw. Something had to be done, and it was, in the shape of King James' son-in-law, the Dutchman, Prince William of Orange. The Orange being a reference to the Provençal town from which the Dutch royal house had originally come. This glorious revolution put William on the English throne and forced his father-in-law James to flee to Ireland. Queen Mary would soon be put in the unenviable position of seeing her husband and her father line up on opposing sides. The series of events to follow were arguably the most important in Ireland's history. The deposed James II gathered his loyal Irish forces and marched north. Soon, most of Protestant Ulster lay at his mercy, with the exception of the walled towns of Enniskillen and Derry. On the 18th of April, 1689, King James presented himself before the walls of Derry. At this time, the River Foyle came right up to the city walls, just one of the defence mechanisms which helped make Derry the stronghold that it was. The Protestant population dithered between resistance and surrender, until the matter was decided by the town's apprentice boys, who promptly slammed the gates shut. The Jacobite troops were fired on from the fortified battlements of the cathedral. The siege of Derry was on. It was surely only a matter of time before the population of Derry, swelled by migration from the countryside, would give in to the all-conquering Jacobite army. But the Jacobites were not equipped for a siege, yet that was precisely what they were now expected to prosecute. Conditions within the walls were vile. The tiny walled town was bursting with civilians, children and old people as well as troops, some reduced to eating rats. Eventually, a Williamite army had landed at Larne, County Antrim, and ships were sent to break the barrier across the River Foyle, allowing supplies into the starving town. They had survived 105 days of siege. The war, however important, was nevertheless a sideshow in a larger European conflict between the French and an English-Dutch coalition. Louis XIV of France was quite happy to see his enemy tied up in Ireland, away from the main conflict, and so sent some of his own troops to help the Catholic Jacobite cause. But after the king's failure at the siege of Derry, the initiative began to slowly slip out of their hands, and they began to be pushed south. Then, in June 1690, the new King of England personally stepped into the arena. William landed at Carrickfergus and proceeded south to Belfast and then to Drogheda at the mouth of the River Boyne. On the 12th of July 1690, a date which lives on in the memory of every Ulster Protestant, King William's troops engaged those of King James in one of the most decisive battles of Irish history. In bright sunshine and intense heat, William's troops, including his Dutch guards, led by massed drums, charged straight for the Boyne and the Jacobite troops on the far bank, plunging through the river under heavy fire. King James's horses charged 3 times, forcing some of the counterattackers back into the river and killing William's commander, General Schomberg. But soon the Jacobite infantry were fleeing, the pursuit being led by William himself across 7 miles of countryside. By 10 o'clock that night, it was all over. James had lost over 3 times as many men as William. This would be the last time that 2 kings would fight each other on the same field of battle in the British Isles. For James, the game was up. He fled to Dublin, then on to France, where he spent his remaining 10 years. The war continued under the command of William's capable general, Ginkell, while William himself found little to detain him in Ireland. The Jacobite cause was defeated again at the Battle of Aughrim in 1691, the really decisive battle of the war, and then again when they were besieged at Limerick. They surrendered and signed the Treaty of Limerick, allowing the Jacobite officers freedom to leave for the continent, the flight of the wild geese. Between 11,000 and 12,000 accepted the offer. The religious toleration promised in the treaty was, however, quickly dishonoured. The English conquest was complete. The long wars were over. Ireland could settle into an exhausted peace. There was now no longer a distinction between the Catholics of Norman extraction and those of Gaelic origin. They were an excluded majority, reduced to second-class status in the wake of the Protestant triumph. At a time when ownership of land meant power, Catholics had less than 10%. They were also forbidden to hold public office or bear arms. Laws were such that younger Catholic sons who conformed to the Protestant Church of Ireland could disinherit their older brothers. Protestants had no particular desire to convert Catholics, simply to neutralize them in the public sphere. All the surface splendour of Ascendancy Ireland could not conceal the general poverty and backwardness of the country. It was in effect an English colonial outpost. The Irish Parliament still couldn't pass laws without the approval of London, and even when that restriction was removed in 1782, the real power still lay with the administration in Dublin Castle, through such figures as the Lord Chancellor John Fitzgibbon, Lord Clare. By the 1770s, a mixture of agrarian unrest in the countryside and the need to find more recruits to fight in the American War of Independence, in India and against France, brought concessions to the Catholics, allowing some of them to vote, join the law professions and take officers' commissions in the army. But by the 1790s, a succession of violent secret societies had sprung up all over Ireland, and particularly in Ulster, where lower-class Protestants and Catholics constantly clashed over employment and land. Out of this emerged the Orange Order, in memory of King William of Orange, the Battle of the Boyne, and Protestant supremacy. The Catholic equivalent were called the Defenders. At this time, the effects of the French Revolution were bubbling throughout Europe. Ideas of democracy, liberty, and popular government were everywhere. The Catholic Irish had longed for a Stuart restoration in the early 18th century, but when this proved impossible, their dreams turned to the notion of being delivered from their bondage by England's great continental enemy, France. It was to the French Revolution that the non-sectarian Society of United Irishmen looked for inspiration. One of them, a young, disaffected liberal Protestant lawyer from Dublin, became the father of Irish republicanism, Theobald Wolfe Tone. Wolfe Tone, very much an idealist, wanted to get away from the traditional sectarian disputes that had always divided his country, and sought to substitute the common name of Irishman in place of the denominations of Protestant, Catholic and Dissenter. He persuaded the French government to send an invasion force to an island ripe for revolution, as he called it. The French fleet sailed in 1796, but whilst at anchor in Bantry Bay, high winds prevented them from landing any troops. The British government and the Dublin administration breathed a sigh of relief. It had been a very close shave. There followed a campaign of government oppression in the countryside to flush out United Irish supporters. The Leinster leadership of the United Irishmen were imprisoned in early 1798. By late May, when the first great rising of 1798 finally erupted in Wexford, it was leaderless except at local level. The rebels fought with great courage, but there were also terrible atrocities committed on both sides. After a month in which nearly 30,000 people died, the Wexford Rising was finally crushed at Vinegar Hill above Enniscorthy. Wolfe Tone arrived from France later in the summer, wearing the uniform of a French officer, but was captured and convicted of treason. He committed suicide rather than let the British hang him. In the aftermath of 1798, London abolished the old Irish Parliament and passed the Act of Union. Ireland became a wholly integrated part of the United Kingdom. Catholic emancipation, which had been intended to accompany the Union, was quickly blocked by King George III, who said it conflicted with his coronation oath to uphold the Protestant nature of the state. But by the 1820s, the campaign for Catholic emancipation, designed to remove remaining Catholic disabilities, was in full swing under the leadership of Daniel O'Connell. A discontented Catholic lawyer, educated in France, he founded the Catholic Association in 1823, its working-class members paying only a penny a month. In the Clare elections of 1828, he challenged a strong government candidate and won, at a time when Catholics were not allowed to become members of Parliament. The British government had to let him take his seat in order to avoid a potentially violent situation. He had successfully mobilized one of the poorest and remotest populations in Europe. In a country where Protestantism was a badge of respectability and social superiority, O'Connell broke the mould and set the tone for Irish nationalism. Overwhelmingly Catholic and populist, it emphasized communal solidarity and was very careful not to offend the priests. Through his alliance with the Whig Party in Parliament, O'Connell forced through legislation which favoured the Irish Catholics. In particular, he secured the repeal of the tithe laws, which had required Catholics to pay a regular sum of money to uphold the Protestant Church of Ireland. This had been a major source of grievance for over 100 years. However, his main aim, the repeal of the Act of Union, couldn't be pushed any further with the arrival of Peel's Tory government at Westminster in 1841. O'Connell's influence was waning. The 1841 census showed a population of over 8 million, probably double that of only 40 years earlier. This teeming population, mostly rural, was almost entirely reliant on one crop, the potato. The constant subdivision of land between families meant that more and more people were crowded onto smaller plots of land, and by 1845, 1/3 of the Irish population was totally reliant on the potato. That same year, an unknown fungus spread throughout the land, destroying much of the crop. Sir Robert Peel's Tory government tried to alleviate the problem with shipments of Indian corn, but when Peel's government fell to be replaced by the Whigs under Lord John Russell, the shipments stopped. Russell's government believed that market forces alone should determine the outcome of events. When the crop failed again the following year, terrible starvation occurred. Relief claimants totaled 750,000 by the spring of 1847, yet the British government, ruling over the richest country in the world, insisted that the relief schemes be funded locally and not centrally. The burden fell on local ratepayers and landlords, many of whom went bankrupt or evicted tenants for non-payment of rent, lest they themselves go under, though many did anyway.
They're the same all over. And you said you were one of ours. Hard times.
Many of Peel's measures, which could have been, I think, constructively and profitably built on to save lives, were abandoned. So from 1846 on, there was a government in office which, while not wishing ill on the Irish, nevertheless felt that it should not take measures that were being urged on it to save lives too actively, shall we say. Initially, the bulk of relief funding came from Britain, really. It was British government funding. Some of that would have been raised in Ireland, but the bulk was raised in Britain. But from really the autumn of about 1847 onwards, when the British government really decided the famine was over, they more or less said, look, the famine has ended, partly because there was a good potato crop in Ireland that year. But they overlooked that, unfortunately, because of the disastrous failure of the crop the previous year, there was very little seed available. And also there was a loss of faith in the potato. So only about 1/6 the normal acreage was sown. So although the yield per acre was good, the total crop only lasted a couple of months. And the famine continued to rage for another 3 years. I'd say at least half the famine dead came after the famine was officially proclaimed to be, for practical purposes, over. And what the government said was, well, look, if there is famine, if there is, let the Irish pay for it themselves. Let Irish property look after Irish poverty. Well, there's been a big dispute about the actual number of dead. And here, unfortunately, the victims of the famine have become victims of ideological conflict among historians. Basically, nationalist historians, Irish nationalist historians, because they were anxious to blame the British government for the famine, wanted to get the biggest famine they could. So their estimates often went up to 1.5 million or even 2 million dead, plus another maybe 1.5 million immigrants. Then either anti-Irish nationalist historians, whom you can call unionist historians, or you can call British nationalist historians if you want to have two nationalisms conflicting, or you can call revisionist historians in current Irish terminology. They wanted to get the lowest possible number dead, because then the British government wouldn't be so responsible insofar as it was responsible at all. So they often went down to 500,000 or something like that. The most authoritative estimate we have now is about 1.1 million dead.
Many local famine stories have since passed into folklore. One such story is that of Tom Gearden of Skibbereen, recounted by local teacher Pat Cleary.
Tom came in here as a 4-year-old in a wooden box. His mother had decided that she would give him a decent burial, went off, found a box which was too small to accommodate his body, so she bent his legs at the knee and managed to squeeze him into the box, brought him in here, dropped him placed him in the pit, and at the end of a day's burial it was customary to throw a light coat of earth on the bodies of that day. And the following morning, when the burial party arrived, they heard noises from this box. And Tom Gearden was rescued. And Tom lived on in this area until 1910. And in that year, he was returned to the burial pits over here. But Tom was a character and a poet, and normally when he visited regattas or horse fairs, he would proclaim himself as, "I'm the poet and I'm the genius." And he made a poem about his own experiences, and it starts off in the following manner: "I rose from the dead in the year 48, though a grave in the abbey had near been my fate. Though 1 shoe points eastwards and 1 shoe points west, I earn my living where'er I can best."
What possible escape could there be for these frightened, impoverished and bitter victims of natural disaster and political indifference? The answer lay in America. There had always been emigration from Ireland, but the famine emigration was different. During the 1840s, over 780,000 people endured insanitary and cramped conditions to escape to America, many leaving from Cove Harbour near Cork. During the next decade, another million followed them. Some went to Australia, others to Britain, but it was emigration to America which became a tradition, which saw 4 million Irish pass through the arrivals hall at Ellis Island, New York, between 1850 and 1930. The emigrants carried with them a hatred of the British government for what they took to be genocidal policies during the famine. The Irish-American support for militant nationalism, separatism and republicanism was always greater than in Ireland itself. In 1858, the Irish Republican Brotherhood was formed. Nicknamed the Fenians after the Fianna, legendary Celtic warriors, they were out-and-out militants seeking to achieve an Irish republic through force of arms and no other means. The Fenians ran a sporadic campaign of blowing up British targets in the 1880s, in particular the House of Commons in 1885, but they fell foul of the Catholic Church, whose head, Cardinal Cullen, had no love for revolutionary conspiracy. In Ulster, however, the situation was totally different. The Industrial Revolution that had spared Ulster the effects of the famine had now really taken off, and Belfast had grown into a booming industrial city. A good education system and the Calvinist work ethic made it a proud part of the United Kingdom. But vicious sectarian rioting became commonplace between the Catholic and Protestant working class, striving to assert or maintain their identity and influence. A long fuse had been lit. By the late 1870s, the nationalist supporters of Home Rule for Ireland had 56 members of Parliament at Westminster. Their leader, Isaac Butt, was replaced by the enigmatic Charles Stewart Parnell, who renamed the party the Irish Parliamentary Party. Although from a Protestant landlord background, he was a passionate nationalist and a political genius. The party managed to push through important legislation, which gave tenants far greater land rights and protection against eviction. In the 1885 election, Parnell found himself with 85 MPs and the balance of power. With this, he forced Prime Minister Gladstone to introduce the first Home Rule Bill. But although his actions served to galvanise Ulster into sending its own MPs to Parliament to counter this very real threat of Home Rule, it was not Ulster which was to be his downfall, but an affair with a certain Kitty O'Shea. The Catholic bishops who wielded immense influence in Ireland withdrew their support for the adulterer, and he died in Kitty's arms at the age of 45. In 1905, Arthur Griffith, a Dublin journalist, formed a small nationalist, though not Republican movement, called Sinn Féin. He wanted Irish MPs to abstain from Parliament and form an assembly in Dublin. Eventually, the third Home Rule Bill came before the House of Commons and produced a violent reaction from the Ulster Protestants under the leadership of Sir James Craig. 400,000 of them signed a solemn league and covenant against Home Rule. They even imported illegal arms to defend their union with Britain. The Home Rule Bill was passed by Parliament in September 1914, but was suspended for the duration of the First World War, a war in which Irishmen of all political hues went into battle. At least 35,000 of them died. There were, however, some that refused to fight a British war and couldn't wait to take advantage of the situation. The IRB sent emissaries to Germany in search of support and arms, and on Easter Monday of 1916, a Fenian uprising occurred in the heart of Dublin. About 2,000 men led by Patrick Pearse and James Connolly seized the General Post Office building and other strategic points in Dublin. They raised the Republican tricolour, and Pearse read the Declaration of the Irish Republic to a slightly bewildered gathering. By now, martial law had been declared, and bitter street fighting developed. Gradually, the British forces dislodged the rebels from their various positions, and by the morning of April the 29th, the GPO building was under violent attack. The British even sailed a gunboat up the Liffey in a further showing of superior firepower, and in the afternoon of the 29th, Pearse and his colleagues surrendered. 15 of the leaders, including Pearse, Connolly and Thomas MacDonagh, were tried, sentenced to death and executed by firing squad. Others, including Eamon de Valera and Michael Collins, were given prison sentences. The British mistakenly blamed Sinn Féin for the uprising, then made a horrendous blunder by introducing conscription to the army. This only served to make heroes of the rebels and unite all the various nationalist groups, including the Catholic Church. As the most radically nationalist party, Sinn Féin, under its new leader Eamon de Valera, made huge gains in the election at the end of the war, but refused to send its 73 members to Westminster. The Volunteers, now called the IRA, fought a sporadic campaign of terrorism against Crown forces for the next 2.5 years, under the leadership of master tactician Michael Collins. The British government responded with the Black and Tans, an undisciplined band of auxiliary policemen whose behaviour did nothing to enhance Britain's reputation. They were thugs. But Protestant Unionist Ulster and the nationalist Catholic South could not agree. London decided on partition. Thus, in 1920, Northern Ireland was born. As for the South, the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921, negotiated on behalf of Sinn Féin by Arthur Griffith and Collins, gave most of nationalist Ireland independence, but not republic status. Much to the annoyance of de Valera, who had not been party to the deal. A worried Michael Collins wrote, "Think, what have I got for Ireland? Something she has wanted these past 700 years. Will anyone be satisfied with the bargain? Will anyone? I tell you this. Early this morning, I signed my death warrant. I thought at the time, how odd, how ridiculous. A bullet may just as well have done the job 5 years ago." The people, however, generally supported the settlement, but Sinn Féin and the IRA split and fought a short, nasty civil war which claimed the lives of both Griffith and Collins. The pro-treaty side won. The new Irish Free State was established. After neutrality in the Second World War, the Irish Free State eventually became the Irish Republic in 1949, with Eamon de Valera continuing as Prime Minister and aided by the Fianna Fáil party that he had created. His protectionist economic policies worked in the short term, but were near collapse by the late 50s, the stark contrast to the economy in the north, supported as it was by London subsidies. But underneath that apparent economic success, Ulster was a bubbling cauldron. The Unionists now only comprised 60% of the population, enough to make them nervous of a Catholic backlash and a reversal of partition. Communal violence broke out once more in 1969 when Catholics held civil rights marches and rebelled against what they saw as the Protestant state control of housing, the jobs market, and other social and political issues. Tit-for-tat retributions have continued.